One of the aspects of Fire and Blood that makes it an especially interesting book is the point of view from which the story is actually written. George R. R. Martin is clearly a huge fan of playing with perspective, but the framing of Fire and Blood as a historical record of House Targaryen's reign in Westeros makes it particularly tricky because it leaves so much up to interpretation. A great deal of the narrative can be whatever you want it to be because the reading of the story is truly up to the reader themselves. Therefore, when it came to adapting the Dance of the Dragons for House of the Dragon, there was a ton of flexibility in developing the so-called reality behind what was ultimately chronicled in the books. And thus far, the show has done a pretty impressive job of interpreting the text and crafting an interesting story with complex characters in a way that still dovetails well with Fire and Blood. But one particular strength of House of the Dragon's interpretation of the story comes about in a somewhat strange way. One specific aspect of Fire and Blood's presentation of the Dance of the Dragons was really odd but pretty rarely questioned by the readers, despite the fact that it probably should have raised immediate alarm bells considering the point of view that this era of Targaryen history was being told through. The rivalry between Alicent and Rhaenyra is obviously at the forefront of the Dance of the Dragons, and in some ways that is a realistic angle to take on the Targaryen civil war. But what has always seemed like a sneaky use of point-of-view trickery is the fact that Alicent and Rhaenyra are portrayed as the driving forces behind the internal Targaryen conflict in a way that really makes no sense and has a clear ring of misogynistic propaganda to it. The societal structure of Westeros before and during the Targaryen dynasty is built on inequality, and gender inequality is one of the cornerstones of that hierarchy. At the point where it actually occurs, Rhaenyra's possible ascent to the throne is an interesting hiccup in an otherwise universal tale of male dominance. Therefore, it doesn't seem coincidental that, in a conflict that nearly destroyed the ruling house and resulted in the decimation of thousands of people, but that also threatened to upset that masculine dominance, the story largely became about Rhaenyra and Alicent as the driving forces behind the catastrophe that is the Dance of the Dragons. That in itself should have been a pretty clear hint to question the lens through which the Dance of the Dragons is viewed. While it's not impossible to believe, the idea that two women were finally in the highest positions of power in Westeros, and they almost immediately nearly destroyed the entire country in the process of fighting to be the top dog, has a very clearly propagandistic ring to it. Even if there is some truth behind it, it seems entirely implausible that, in a society where women are intentionally shut out of power, two women were at the forefront of one of the greatest power struggles in history. Obviously, that's not to say that Alicent and Rhaenyra had no impact on what happened during the dance. However, it seems far more likely that they were retrospectively painted as the ultimate villains and driving forces behind the conflict for a very specific reason, as, according to the in-universe logic of Fire and Blood, the structure of society itself, and the extra dose of misogyny that seemed to color the era, fundamentally guarantees that no woman could ever truly gain the kind of power that Rhaenyra and Alicent are portrayed as having. One of the more valid, or at least understandable, complaints about House of the Dragon thus far has been the show's continuing theme of many of the biggest events in the story being accidental, or being far less influenced by the main characters than Fire and Blood would make readers believe. And while there is a fair criticism to be made of the choice to make Alicent and Rhaenyra take a back seat to characters like Daemon, Otto, and Viserys, who have pretty consistently been the players who are making big moves, it's undeniably a more faithful interpretation of the world that George R. R. Martin has built. Obviously, Alicent and Rhaenyra are both far more powerful than almost every other woman who exists in their society. But House of the Dragon's interpretation of events solidly demonstrates that, regardless of how much they've managed to climb the social hierarchy, they're still not taken seriously as legitimate power players in this world. And unfortunately but believably, a lot of the power that they do gain or wield is gained through the power that the men around them actually have and aren't under constant threat of losing. One of the most consistent criticisms of Alicent Hightower is that her character is a misogynist because she is fighting for her son's claim to the throne instead of supporting Rhaenyra, which is a bizarre, extremely reductive take that doesn't remotely acknowledge the position that Alicent is actually in. She exists in a society where a woman's value is determined by the men in power around her. And Alicent is so starkly contrasted with Rhaenyra not because of any mismatched belief systems, but simply because the men around Alicent don't care about her enough to give her power in the way that they do Rhaenyra. Her father's feelings toward her are pretty ambiguous for the story thus far, and while there are indications that he does sincerely care about her, he certainly isn't treating her in the way that Viserys treats Rhaenyra. He is still using Alicent as a political tool, and even if he's trying to maneuver her out of the pickle that he maneuvered her into in the first place, he's not giving her any of his political power or clout to use in her own right. Ironically, although we only get clues indicating that Alicent has been ruling in Viserys' stead for years, she similarly gets no power from Viserys either. Their relationship is not a great one, and Viserys seems to continually see Alicent as a means to his particular ends. Whether that is comfort after his first wife's death, someone who can offer him more heirs, or someone who can manage his affairs and duties when he's not in the position to. Although Alicent is literally the queen and appears to have a heavy hand in running the Seven Kingdoms, everything that she does is meaningless in the face of the whims of a sick, elderly man who has never held any favor toward her or her children. Based on her title alone, Alicent should theoretically be the most powerful woman in Westeros. And yet, she can't even claim bodily autonomy against the men who are in positions of power over her, which is something that people like Viserys and Larys are aware of and exploit as well. And although Aegon isn't a particularly appealing king or devoted son, based on Alicent's life experience and the sexism built into Westeros' society, it should come as no surprise that Alicent advocates for him to take the throne. The decision to make Viserys' deathbed words into something that Alicent misunderstood as support for Aegon was probably not the strongest choice that House of the Dragon made for this specific reason. But Alicent's belief about Viserys' wishes still don't change the reality that Alicent is consistently at the mercy of the men around her, and those men have shown little to no care or consideration for her as a person. Aegon is a pathetic, abusive misogynist like nearly every other man that Alicent has to deal with. But in contrast to people like Viserys, Larys, or Otto, he also does genuinely care about his mother and seeks her approval. Given that she rightfully understands that this succession crisis is likely a life-or-death situation for her and her children, her desire to advocate for Aegon's claim is legitimately her best option. And yes, clearly the fact that Aegon is male impacts Alicent's decision to advocate for him. But her entire life has been controlled by the whims of the men in power around her. So it should come as no surprise that she's advocating for someone who might give her at least some respect or power in return. And to claim that Alicent is only fighting for Aegon because she's a misogynist is a hilariously reductive take that blames a woman for trying to operate within a violently misogynistic society rather than literally sacrificing her life in service of another woman just possibly gaining more power. The dichotomy of Alicent and Rhaenyra's power differential is most clearly articulated in what is arguably the most layered scene of House of the Dragon thus far. The confrontation after Aemond loses his eye. It's here where we see Alicent's complete powerlessness and Rhaenyra's power. But more importantly, we see why this power differential actually exists. On paper, the differences between Rhaenyra and Alicent are obvious. Alicent is the daughter of a second son of House Hightower, while Rhaenyra is a Targaryen through her maternal and paternal bloodline. She is Viserys' named heir, and of course, she has the literal, objective strength of a dragon behind her. However, many other women in Targaryen history can claim the same, so this moment really clarifies what it is that makes Rhaenyra different from the rest. And that is, quite simply, that her father is the king and he favors her over everyone else. In a sense, that also makes some of Rhaenyra's bad decisions more understandable. While many in the audience choose to ignore some of the legitimately terrible things that she does do, understanding her real position makes her lousier actions more comprehensible too. Because again, on certain objective metrics, Rhaenyra is more powerful than nearly every other woman alive. Namely, she has a dragon. But other women like Rhaenys and Laena also have dragons, and that still hasn't put them on or near the Iron Throne. And, While Rhaenyra seems to be a little extra keen on the idea that she is a super special Targaryen and therefore none of the rules apply to her, on some level she pretty clearly understands that Viserys is the one who truly grants her power. She certainly uses his favoritism to her advantage when she needs to, and she also seems aware that any hope she has of actually making it onto the Iron Throne is almost entirely reliant on his support. Beyond that, while Daemon is clearly a groomer creep who attempted to regain the position that he lost by manipulating his niece, Rhaenyra's desire to marry Daemon long before Viserys was actually gone seems to demonstrate a significant awareness that Rhaenyra would need the support of a man at or near the top of the totem pole if she ever wanted to claim that ultimate Iron Throne power for herself. And, while characterizing Rhaenyra as a feminist protagonist is giving her too much credit, not acknowledging that her sexist choices are heavily influenced by an outrageously sexist society isn't fair either. Despite Viserys' claims that he wants absolute primogeniture to guide the Iron Throne inheritance going forward, Rhaenyra doesn't seem to be following in his footsteps, at least if her attempt at a bargain with Rhaenys is any indication. She offers betrothals between her sons, Jace and Luke, and Rhaenys' granddaughters, Baela and Rhaena, and she specifically says that Baela and Rhaena's sons will inherit Driftmark and the Iron Throne. Meaning that while Rhaenyra becoming Queen Regnant will at least advance the power that women can possibly hold in a real, concrete sense, she is not currently intending to enhance the status of any other women, or upset the male dominance of society at large if or when she does become queen. However, it's worth acknowledging that Rhaenyra isn't really in a position to do that even if she wanted to. She doesn't seem to harbor any secret desire to advance the positions of anyone besides the members of her immediate family anyway. But her behavior seems to indicate awareness that her position alone is incredibly precarious. So doing anything to even further upset the status quo after attempting to take the throne for herself would not only likely fail, but could lead to her losing whatever power she actually did gain in the first place. So, House of the Dragon's interpretation of Rhaenyra and Alicent's roles in the Dance of the Dragons is a bit of a double-edged sword. Of course it would be more interesting and inspiring to see two women be at the head of a conflict over the greatest power in the realm, but it wouldn't really make sense within the broader context of the fantasy world that this story exists in. The fact that Otto has been plotting Aegon's coronation without Alicent's input or even knowledge shouldn't be surprising, because Alicent's influence only goes as far as the men who value her. Viserys has no regard for Alicent beyond what she can do for him, which is one of the biggest reasons why her children got the shaft for their entire lives in the first place. But that disregard further excludes Alicent from the political realm that is already designed to keep her out anyway. She may be the queen, but people around her don't see her as someone with enough influence to warrant inclusion, even in machinations that are about as directly relevant to her as they possibly could be. And frankly, their perception of Alicent as a powerless figurehead is more or less correct. Similarly, it should come as no surprise that Daemon is ready and eager with a plan to fight against Rhaenyra's rivals, despite the fact that Rhaenyra seemingly had no part to play in these plans, nor would she necessarily consent to what Daemon wants. And regardless of whether or not his feelings for her are real, Daemon's relationship with Rhaenyra has always been significantly driven by reclaiming the power that Viserys took from him and gave to her when Viserys named Rhaenyra his heir in Daemon's stead. From a narrative standpoint, this conflict makes sense and was built up from the moment the story started as well. Otto and Daemon's rivalry was the first domino that even led to Rhaenyra becoming Viserys' heir to begin with, and that initial battle ballooned into what eventually became the Dance of the Dragons. But ultimately, the tale that Fire and Blood wove about two women holding all of the cards and duking it out to see who would wind up on top never made sense within the context of the world of Westeros. A political system that intentionally excludes women from power whenever possible wouldn't go from Viserys winning the throne over Rhaenys' better claim to two women being in the highest positions of influence in a single generation. Ergo, the contemporaneous and historical characterization of Rhaenyra and Alicent as the leading forces in the Dance of the Dragons, all the way to literally defining the rivalry by the color of these women's dresses, is more likely a reflection of the misogyny that is built into this world than it is of the reality that these women somehow managed to gain a level of power that no women had before, and then immediately nearly destroyed the realm with it. Alicent and Rhaenyra are undoubtedly the most important characters within the story, but that doesn't mean that they're the most powerful or influential. They are two women who wound up in a higher position than most, but who were always playing a game that was rigged against them. The Dance of the Dragons was never about girl power. The point of view of Fire and Blood was just designed to make you think that it was. But what do you think? Is House of the Dragon's interpretation of Alicent and Rhaenyra's political power more believable than Fire and Blood's? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.